Hello, hello, welcome. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to give it a few moments while people trickle in. You're all having a lovely Wednesday. It's great to see so many people here today. This is awesome. All right. Well, I think I'm seeing the attendees list kind of starting to level off, so I think we'll get started. Um, Welcome to Inventorying for Archives. My name is Greg Stewart. I'm the Education Program Manager at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCHA as we call it. And I use they and he pronouns. For accessibility's sake, I will say I'm a white person with a collared shirt and headphones and kind of dark hair, and my background is blurred right now. And so just a little bit more about today's program. So inventorying collections is one of the most crucial parts of any collections management program. A complete inventory underpins good intellectual control, emergency preparedness and response and security, as well as helps to determine processing and preservation priorities. That's a lot of alliteration there. In this webinar, Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York, or DHPSNY, as we call it. We'll get into that a little bit more about what that is if you're not aware. Archive Specialist Kate Philipson will discuss the process and principles for carrying out a basic inventory of your archival materials, recognizing the unique challenges and opportunities inherent in working with collections of records in the aggregate. While this webinar will mainly focus on archival records, Kate will also touch upon what to do when you have a mixed collection that includes 3D objects or other non-archival materials. So before we get into Kate's presentation, just some housekeeping stuff here. You're in Zoom webinar, so your video and audio are turned off, but you are fully welcome to make comments or ask questions in the chat. This program is auto-closed captioned in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. So we're going to have a presentation today with our speaker, followed by Q&A with you. And please feel free to ask questions anytime during the program, and I'll be reading off those questions at the end to Kate verbally. So we are recording the program, as you see, and we'll be sending that recording as well as PowerPoint and any other resources we've shared in a follow-up email. And just a big thanks to the National Endowment for Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation, who make today's program possible. So as you see, thank you, Kate, for putting up that slide. Just a quick note about the organization I work for, the CCHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artwork on paper, and more. Our preservation services staff work in the field, providing education programs and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing, framing, and more. And you can learn more about what we do at our website, ccha.org. And just a little bit more about our speaker. As the archive specialist for the DHPSNY program, Kate Philipson conducts on-site archival needs assessments and assists with archival preservation planning. She also develops and presents educational programs like this one and provides technical information to library and archival repositories in New York State. And Kate received her MA in Archives and Public History from NYU and her BA in Film and Media Arts and American Studies from Temple University. So with that, I can turn it over to you, Kate.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Greg. As Greg mentioned, my name is Kate. I use she, her pronouns, and for accessibility purposes, I am a white woman with short brown hair, sitting on a chair with a very high back. And behind me is a window and a plant. And some shelves with a lot of Criterion Collection Blu-rays on it. I am the archivist, the archive specialist for the DHPSNY program. Again, I'll read it out, even though the name's very long. It's Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York. So we're very much a part of the Conservation Center. I work in the same department as Greg, but our program is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library. And so services are provided by the Conservation Center. Our work aligns with a lot of preservation services at the Conservation Center, but it's focused on New York State specifically. So just to flesh that out a tiny bit, right? DHPSNY is a statewide program for all kinds of collecting institutions across New York. We provide free planning and assessment and education services to support archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other kinds of nonprofit organizations with a lot of history to sort of safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. As mentioned, right, we do archival needs assessments, preservation surveys, condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and we also run a whole series of webinars, workshops, education programs. I just did an online course about Archives 101 stuff that was really well attended and was really fun. What else do we do? Oh, we go to conferences. We do a lot of technical assistance. So there's a wide array of services. They're all free if you're in New York State and you're a nonprofit organization. So please feel free to visit our website. It's not on this slide. It's just DHPSNY.org. Or you can also easily find it through the Conservation Center's website. We're sort of under the projects tab if you're more familiar with that space. Yeah, I think maybe it's also worth saying that the DHPSNY team really largely supports and works with small to medium-sized organizations. So that's a lot of who I have in mind when I was developing this program and sort of thinking about inventory work. That's been a lot of my experience, is working with small staffs, or sometimes one staff person and or no staff and a large volunteer cohort. Sometimes or often, I'd say the amount of collections materials, right, feel really outsized to the time and resources and labor capacities of the organization. So we really try to strive with that in mind. We try to work towards like a good, better approach, meaning that like best practices, well, important to know and keep in mind, like they're not that important if you can't achieve them, right? And so it's more worthwhile to work towards good and better approaches with the resources that you have and the things that are attainable. So again, that's kind of the philosophy behind a lot of what you'll see in this webinar. I will also say about this webinar, it's really structured to be a little bit of a part two to my colleague Katie Lowe, who presented a similar inventorying for museum collections webinar about 3 months ago, towards the end of October. So that is also recorded. It's on the CCHA website and YouTube page. And so I just want to sort of note that this is really structured to be a part two. You're going to see a handful of references to Katie's presentation, which was really excellent, warm, informative, encouraging. And then you'll sort of see that this one has some similar structure, tries to build off of that work without being too repetitive. And I tried to incorporate some more information that is really focused on archival collections and archival materials. while also considering, right, that so many folks and so many kinds of collections have a mix of museum and archival materials. So the overview, the agenda of just what we're going to be speaking to today, I'll use the same agreements and understandings as Katie did, which we can go through quickly just to sort of underpin the ethos and approach of what we want to bring to an inventory project. We'll take a quick look at how museum collections differ from archival collections, really in how we conceptualize them and sort of start to consider why this will matter for the inventory process. We'll dive into the whys and hows of really conducting the inventory itself, doing the process, and then we'll consider a handful of situations that you might encounter while you're inventorying the stuff that feels challenging or weird or like it doesn't really fit in easily with the rest of the process. And then I'll sort of reference resources throughout. We'll take a look at those and then make sure there's plenty of time for questions. So to just sort of set the stage, it's important. We're really going to ask that in this process where you might be dealing with a really overwhelming amount of collections, to try to be gentle with yourself and be realistic with yourself. It's a big project. We don't want people to have to feel the level of stress that can sort of inherently come with this kind of work, right? So you don't have to rush into it. We're really going to encourage you to like take the time to plan and prepare and be ready to start with a lot of pieces already in place. A good inventory will take time and it will to some degree be imperfect anyway, right? And so this is all okay. So just worth starting with that in mind. And then understandings about this session. You won't leave as an expert on inventories. I'm not an expert on inventories, right? Maybe some of what you'll see through these slides is that there are so many things the project kind of depends on. There's so many, I'd say like, every process is different for every institution. So it's not your job to do it perfectly, but to try to understand the baseline of what you want to set up for yourself. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, but modification is great. This is to say there are lots of resources out there already. There's policy and procedure and inventory templates, but again, you'll probably need to modify and shift some of that stuff to fit your own situation and institution and collection. Perfectionism isn't your friend. It's okay to really just get started and work to improve over time. I am often very guilty of not doing the thing at all until it's all ready and perfect and set to go. And we're hoping that this webinar will encourage you to get started, even if every single detail isn't mapped out perfectly. Stress can get you started, but is really hard to sustain with, right? It's not a thing that is going to help you actually carry through and get to the end of this process. So just this is sort of taken from Katie's presentation, and I thought it was a really great way to sort of think about what's going to motivate you on this journey, right? Like it's not a marathon. Sorry, it is a marathon, not a sprint. So it's going to take time. Knowledge is power. You want to be able to avoid the issues in your collection, but it's also it's sort of natural, right, to like not want to think about all the problems there might be, but it's more powerful and more important to be able to have a full understanding of the collection's scope and what you're working with in your collection. And then the concept of like the dishes are never done is really thinking about this as an ongoing process, right? Once you have completed a comprehensive inventory, there's going to be more work to do. There's going to be another point where you're going to want to inventory again in the future. So just try not to feel the pressure to be finished or done with this process comprehensively. Okay, so the biggest distinction in this webinar from the one that Katie presented a few months ago is really that archival collections are structured differently than museum collections. I'm going to first start with just what an inventory is, and then what archives are as they differ from museums, and sort of just lay out the basics of that plan, and then we'll kind of dive into the rest of the pieces. So again, this is similar to what Katie had shared with us, right? A general definition of an inventory at its most basic is really just a list of objects. If you're lucky, it's a list of objects and their locations. And at the most comprehensive, right, it's a super detailed level of a report or a complete report of the status of collections, right? So inherently, there's a lot of detail and a lot of information in there. She mentions, though, right, Katie also sort of shared that within this scale, most organizations and people like have a more realistic thing somewhere in the middle, a list of property held by the collecting organization, ideally connecting every object or collection to an identification number, a physical location, and an intellectual record. So I do think it's important to clarify here that a lot of archives world speak and language sort of centers around archival records. So in this definition, the intellectual record is just the thing that helps describe or define the thing you're inventorying. It's not the same as your archival records that make up your collection. In other words, the papers, the documents, the ephemera, the collections themselves. So this intellectual record separate from your archival records. But I think here, right, it can be easy to see where we have to deviate already from thinking about museum collections, which really are focused on individual objects. The museum fundamentally operates by documenting and knowing and labeling and having information about every item. Yeah, it can be a wide variety of things. But on the other side, right, archives are managed by collections. They're unique materials. They are often records, archival records sort of created by a person, a family, an organization, a government, which is not on this list. So they're sort of collections of groups of materials by and large. Of course, though, with that in mind, right, there are many similar goals and activities between the work of a museum and of an archive. I trust most of us here already sort of know and understand these things, but I just want to get across that there are different ways that will fundamentally like conceptualize and therefore manage the varying types of materials, even though the hope is and the goal and the mission of our work is to collect, preserve, interpret, or provide context, make materials available and accessible, and that we're doing that with things that sort of have like a permanent or continuing value. Okay, so let's look a tiny bit closer at what that intellectual structure that I just referenced sort of means for archives, right? And make sure that we know what we're talking about when we talk about archives and archival collections. I'm hopefully just going to gloss over this because DHPSNY and CCHA both have many other webinars and types of other educational programming that speak to archival arrangement and structure. So I'll encourage you to check those out. They'll be a part of the resources, but just for a quick overview, most archival collections are made up of original records, something unique that's created in the course of doing business or doing an activity or engaging in some kind of doing, for lack of a better phrase, right? But part of the importance of this is that collections sort of like fundamentally exist in a context of how they were created. So we largely consider them in the aggregate on the whole, right? The collection is the defining thing by which you manage an archive. And therefore, in this case, it's going to be the defining thing by which we think about inventorying materials. I want to stress, I'm going to stress this throughout the presentation, you should not be documenting every item or piece of paper that is within the archival collection. This is not the job of an archives. It's not the job of an archivist. In part, an archivist's job is really to preserve the contextual relationships between the records and the materials, right? This is fundamental to the core of the goals we saw before, right? To sort of collect, preserve, make accessible. Maintaining the context and helping people sort of access raw materials and bring a level of understanding to them. The significance and importance of archives really largely comes from those contextual relationships within these materials, within the primary source materials, right? The stuff that, again, was sort of created in the course of doing the work. So you can eventually drill down to look at those individual materials worth highlighting. We really, in all the other sort of programming we have about this, you can think about archives on a hierarchical scale. So if you're starting big and broad and thinking about the relationships within a collection overall, you can eventually spend more time and drill down to be understanding the materials on a more specific basis. But I would argue that that's further down the line, and the hope of sort of this broader basic inventory is to get an understanding of all the materials that are within the collection. I'm going to throw another archival concept at you real quickly. It's just these two principles that sort of can help you define what a collection looks like, which is really not always a straightforward thing. We'll touch on it a tiny bit at the end. It might be able to be its own whole webinar topic. But it's important to think about how we're going to define our collections, and then understand how to retain all of that important context I was just referencing. So with provenance, this first principle, it just states that a collection is usually designated or defined by the records of one person or organization. You don't really want to mix them up with someone else's records. That is going to help preserve the context. Original order says that the organization and sequence of the records that was established by the creator of the records. Again, this could be a person, it could be an organization or business, it could be a government, it could be a family sometimes. However those things are sort of arranged and organized and set in place, you're hoping to preserve and maintain that order. The third thing to note here is that sometimes, right, I assume and expect that everyone is thinking, well, that's impossible, right? There's so many other kinds of collections in my organization. There are so many other things that are not solely dictated by the person, family, business that created them. And so there's a broad way to define these, but those are typically called artificial collections. It sounds harsher than it is, maybe, because everyone has them in their repository overall. You want to sort of avoid creating them if you don't need to, but it's really just saying when the provenance or the original order has been lost, and so the archivist or the collections committee or the volunteers, right, someone is determining a collection based on the subject, the material type, or another variety of factors that is not set in provenance. One more piece of the structure here, I kind of just mentioned slightly this level of hierarchy. and thinking about arrangement, it's just worth noting that if the repository is your organization, the collection level is the thing we're going to focus on inventorying in this webinar. I came up with a silly example. I don't know if it works perfectly, but if you think about this structure within calling something the sports greats archive, right? Then the collection within that sports archive is the Michael Jordan papers or Michael Jordan collection. And then the series helps you sort of define and break out the intellectual groupings of what's important to understand about that collection. So within Michael Jordan's papers, we might be thinking about college basketball, NBA, professional basketball career, and his baseball career. And maybe there's another category represented like US Olympics or endorsement and corporate relationships. It depends on the materials, but those are just examples of logical series. So they're the big sort of functional categories that really help you bring some order to the collection. They help a researcher understand how things get organized and how file level is organized. And then if absolutely necessary, if you have, I didn't come up with a great Michael Jordan item example, but if you had something really of high value, so important, it helped set all the clarity for how to understand Michael Jordan. Well, then that one item you would probably describe and highlight it within the collection. It's rare that we're going to focus on individual items within an archival collection. Even if right, this collection never really gets arranged and processed beyond a series level, there's still this fundamental of understanding what kinds of topics and ideas are held within it. Okay. So we will take a closer look now at how those archival concepts and structures can apply to your inventory process. And I did want to also sort of really define that, sort of like you just saw with an archival collections hierarchy, right? An inventory can be defined on a few different levels. You can have a really basic, broad institutional level repository. Those are all kind of speaking to the same thing. And this is what we're going to focus on here, right? So an overview of your entire repository, a list of all the collections, and this is going to be a really key internal tool for your organization to use. We're not necessarily in this webinar going to speak to spot inventories or a section or partial inventory today. Katie also referenced them, and they can be a really great tool for certain needs, but they're not typically, and they're going to be best used sort of after a more overarching or broad inventory is complete anyway. So it's just important to know that this is like your comprehensive level. You want a full understanding of all the collections that the organization holds. And a more detailed inventory can also be done with any given collection, right? You can do this. This is often conducted sort of when a collection comes in, sort of on acquisition or accession, detailing sort of what materials are within each collection. So this kind of inventory can be a useful tool to underpin your archival description, right? Or it can go in description and be public information on a series or folder level, or a folder or item level. And it shouldn't really be like a part of your first steps, again, if you're inventorying, right? So that's why we're just not going to talk about it in any other detail here today. It's just important to know that you can think about inventorying at different levels within the archival hierarchy of materials. That's some of the what, and I just also want to speak quickly to the who. Right, ideally, you're going to have a staff person or a dedicated volunteer or a committee of folks working on this inventory project. You want someone who's had some level of familiarity with the collections or the institution, especially if your collections are not yet all defined, sort of very specifically set and understood. It's going to be hard for someone to just step in and know all the details about how your organization works, what your goals are, sort of how everything that has happened thus far informs what will come in the future. There's the list. Ideally, you want to also be thinking about teams of 2 people or more. You want to ensure that there's cross-training and consistency when you're working on this project. I've had folks ask me before if an inventory can be a sort of intern or a student project, and this is certainly valid in some situations, and I think those folks can be really useful extras and addendums to have on a project like this, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that a fully comprehensive project of an institutional inventory should be led or directed by an intern, right? An internship is also supposed to be a learning experience, and an intern is just not going to understand your institutional priorities, collections, histories of how materials have been managed in the past, as well as someone who's been there for a while. So an intern or a student can easily be trained to support this process. And so now we can look quickly at the why, right? Thinking about the what, the who, the why. So I'm just copying this slide from Katie's presentation, and I know it speaks to museums, and I know that throws off my whole archive spiel, but I do think it's really important to sort of consider archives or museum collections that are in the public trust as something that is managed on a, there's a greater good here, right? So this quote just says, the objects in our collections are not ours. They are not even our museums or our archives. These objects belong to current and future generations, and as such, are not ours to lose track of or misplace. So that comes from the Museum Registration Methods, 5th edition. I think another way to consider this level of accountability for collections held in the public trust can just be the basic: know what you have, know where it is, take good care of it, right? Those 3 things are really fundamental to operating a publicly held archival collection. Here are some other reasons, in addition to public accountability, for wanting to do an inventory. Intellectual control is a really key one. Why are you saving this stuff if you don't know what it is, right? You want to be able to have strong intellectual control to help set and clarify your policies and procedures, which can also help with transparency and accountability, right? You want to ensure that your collections align with the organization's mission and the collecting scope. These things can impact your accessioning and deaccessioning policies. So that's a really key part of intellectual control for me. Intellectual control can also improve access and use of your materials, which should be usually one of the core tenets of the work you do, right? Providing materials that are accessible for research, interpretation, exhibits, other outreach and connections, other kinds of opportunities and partnerships. All that stuff is harder if you don't know what is actually held in the collection, what the information and materials are. And then linking, sort of saving time and improving resource allocation comes with intellectual control, because you can link it directly to physical control, right? How often have you sort of thought, oh, I know this is like in here somewhere, and had to go find it and spend time and spend energy sort of tracking something down? So if you know where it is within this kind of inventory, it'll help you make decisions and help you save time. I think a few more whys include preservation and collections care needs. It's really helpful for safety and security of the collections and of the people working with them to sort of know what is where. Really key that you have a sense of where your glass plate negatives are, for instance, right? If they're not labeled well, if they're on a high shelf, if they're in an area where they could be knocked or jostled by something else, then your collections are in danger, and so are the people who work in that space, potentially, right? It's really important when thinking about insurance claims and policies and emergency preparedness, setting salvage priorities. You really, again, you have to know what you have, you have to know where it is, and that information can help you respond more confidently if hopefully never there is a scenario or emergency that impacts your collections and space. It's also important for health concerns in terms of hazardous materials potentially. You know, I know folks think about taxidermy, or the one that's at the top of my mind for other reasons right now is sort of vinegar syndrome or acetate film deteriorating. If it gets to a really bad state of deterioration, it will impact your other film collections that are around it, and it's bad for your health. It's not going to breathe it in. So it's important to sort of have a sense of, if there's film, where does it live? What kind of condition is it in? And just thinking about funding opportunities for potentially trying to prioritize or allocate resources, right? Know where you can, within inventory, you can know where you want to do more detailed processing or digitization work, where you need newer, different housing materials. Seeking funding opportunities for those needs becomes much easier and clearer once you have a sense of the materials in the collection from your inventory. So we can take a quick look at the process overview. This is, again, not so different from Katie's process, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. But it's important to sort of be thinking about the planning aspects of this inventory process. And I think it could be fair to say that if you put a lot of time and energy and effort into this plan, then there's not so much left to do once you start inventorying, other than sort of just diving in, right? You'll sort of have a baseline of how to operate. You'll have tried to answer some questions in advance, right? Probably not everything, but to the best of your ability, right? So the more time you spend on planning, the smoother the inventory work will run. Yeah, I think I'll just try to highlight some of these things, especially where they might be different as you're looking at an archival collection or on a broad collection level. And again, right, not looking at each piece of paper. And if you can help it, potentially not even looking at every folder that might be in a box. So along these lines of making a plan, right, it's going to be important to establish the purpose and scope of your inventory. What goals do you have for the inventory? There really can be many different kinds of uses. As in, if you were recovering from a disaster or an emergency and you needed a scope of what was impacted, that would be different than trying to gain a sense of comprehensive intellectual control over the materials. So the goals are impacted sort of by the purpose, right? Your resources and time, and understanding what is attainable and practical for you and your collection and your resources. Those things all feed into the purpose and the scope of what you're going to accomplish. Estimating your timeline and workflow, is also important, right? It's just good to have a sense of what this work is going to take. Obviously, it's based on many factors. Obviously, it helps to be conservative and estimate longer than you think you might need, because things will change or surprise you. It's worth considering how you're going to sustain your momentum and energy when working through this process. Katie had a really great idea of establishing sort of goalposts or checkpoints within the inventory process to sort of have set, stable, here's where we're at, this is what it looks like now, is there anything we need to adjust, let's move forward. And that can be really great, especially if you're working on a team. But I'd say is important even if you're not working with a team. And then thinking about the sort of physicality, right, of how you're gonna move through collections, how you're really gonna like physically do the workflow of inventorying. Are you gonna try and do it by collection type? Are you going to try and do it by room if you have multiple spaces? Are you going to think about each box or cabinet? So there's a few different ways you can really organize or arrange your physical workflow that of course relates directly to thinking about your physical space, right? Consider planning in advance, especially. I think the most important thing about space is to sort of designate the different areas of your collection storage. So I have an extra slide or two about this in a minute, just to drill down and really be thinking about how you're going to label areas of your workspace and of your collection storage, right? Also think about where your actual workspace is going to exist. Where are you going to work from? Do you need a folding table set up somewhere? Do you have room to write on a clipboard? Do you need a place to place a laptop? Are you going to be in motion, right? I think with object collection, sometimes there is so much more detailed process of working on the individual objects itself that it's fair to move the collections to where your workspace is. But when we're talking about archival collections, sort of in these bigger, broadest categories, we could be talking about a few folders, or we could be talking about 70 boxes, right? Like, so you're not going to move all those 70 boxes to somewhere else just to be able to inventory them. So thinking about the way that you will complete your workflow as you move physically around the space is really key. I think it's really important to point out that you should use what you already have. Any kind of intellectual information at all, any kind of collection records. Do you have an accession log? Do you have any correspondence, right? Does stuff have numbers on it already, even if you're not totally sure what those numbers correspond to? Considering the information you already have about collections, or just collections like detail, that stuff is really key to consider and use as best you can, even if it's just to say, okay, that didn't work, that existed, it doesn't work for our current needs, so we need to adjust. The other logistics are really kind of thinking about defining your information structure, which we'll also talk about in a sec. I want you to be planning and preparing for what kinds of fields of data you're going to complete in this inventory work, right? The literal information that you're going to collect. You should be thinking about documentation, decisions, and processes, especially if the inventory is a multi-purpose effort. I don't know, bringing a sense of transparency and description to the work you're doing as you're prepping and planning for the inventory. I know it's another layer of like, describe this thing or think it through, but sort of for anyone in the future, for your institutional memory, it's really important to be documenting the choices that you're making about what the inventory is going to look like. And then it's also really helpful to think about how you're going to flag or address any problems that you come across. You'll probably be doing that stuff after the inventory process, but that's also important to think about, right? If you come across a box that is somehow is stuck under 10 other boxes and is like cracking on the sides from all the weight of the other stuff on top of it, are you going to address that now, or are you going to flag it in a specific way to be able to come return to it and replace the box after the inventory process? I do want to speak again sort of specifically to thinking about the physical space as you inventory. Organizing your collection storage area if possible. I think there are some arguments for and against this, and maybe it's more important to say organize your storage area if necessary. The necessity might be if you can't label any spaces because it's too messy and there's nothing to be able to define so as to associate a collection record with a location, then you might need to rearrange and be able to sort of have some clear locations, even if you're in the same room. If you can't, I had another example, sort of if it just feels so cluttered, if you can't reach materials, right? If there's so many layers of stuff, or if shelves go so high up to the ceiling, if you can't access the stuff that you're trying to inventory, that is also a good argument for trying to organize the storage area, at least basically. I'm not saying like, make this its own crazy project, but if it's important to understanding the pieces involved in the inventory, then it's worth considering. Are you going to keep the stuff you're inventorying in the space it's currently in, right? Might you need to find a better space as you're inventorying, or think about a place to move collections to afterwards? I know that so many different organizations always this is a constant problem for everyone, right? Everyone needs more space to do this work. Storage rooms are full, overstuffed. But it's worth considering and thinking about where else you can carve out room to work, at least sort of while you're doing the inventory process. Another thing to consider in terms of space is if you have any quarantine space. It's possible that you're going to come across a collection surprise, right? A hazard, some kind of mold or pest, and you really want to be able to isolate that material and not keep it in the other collection space that your materials are in and that you are in on a regular basis. Consider also sort of planning in advance how you name or designate each space. We're talking about room, shelf or drawer, just recording a location field for each collection that you include in your inventory should be really defined. So I love this idea of a hierarchical location authority, and we'll just take a quick look at something like what this could look like. So this is the slide directly from the Connecting to Collections Care American Institute of Conservation webinar. The webinar is from 2016. We'll have a link to it. Has a lot of great resources. It's called A Place for Everything and Everything in Its Place, Conducting and Maintaining a Collection Inventory. And so I just think this is such a great example of looking hierarchically at I don't know, just how to structure and design something like this, because there are so many different kinds of spaces. It's important to think about tools as you're inventorying, your intellectual tools, sort of what you need to have on hand to be prepared. Again, this includes a lot of the same things we just talked about planning for, the policies and procedures, the numbering system, the standard. The one I'll highlight is like a standard vocabulary, right? Think about how your terminology is going to be consistent. You can note this sort of within the inventory work so that it's you want nothing to like be a question mark of how to reconcile afterwards, right? This can both be technical, like you might want to decide what you're going to call boxes of different sizes. Are they document boxes? Are they record cartons? Just have a consistent term for these kinds of considerations, and then the information content as well, right? Defining sort of assumed or local terms or acronyms, people's names and businesses' names, especially if a woman has a married name and a maiden name, right? Figuring out sort of the full details of how people are going to be referred to. I'm going to speed a little more quickly through these next few slides because we're coming up to question and answer time. But I just want to point out the highlights that what information you're going to include in your inventory really is based on your goals, your institutional history, and the types of materials that you have. So again, this is why planning and understanding the organization and the collections are so important to do up front. This is some of the information that is worth including. This is not comprehensive. It doesn't have to be everything. I'm not saying this is it. I'm not saying you have to have all of these things. It's just good to be thinking about sort of both the work and the process of what you're doing, right? Who's doing the inventory work, where things are, how you're going to flag stuff, and then the collection record information, having identifying numbers, understanding the creator or donor, which can often be based in provenance, that archival principle we talked about up front, which is often the defining structure of a collection, certainly not always. The collection name, what kinds of materials are included. I put measurements in brackets to say that's a big one that's up to you. It will take more time to measure your stuff, but if you are moving, maybe you have a new collection space that is an opportunity, and you're going to be shifting collections into that space at some point, having measurements might be a key thing that you incorporate into the goals for your inventory. These next steps are also important. You want to be able to address sort of once you've completed a full scope of understanding what the collections are, address the flags that you have, make sure you back it up in a few places. Maybe have a hard copy, maybe have it on the cloud, maybe put it on an external hard drive, have it on a server, put it in a few places. Make sure you have a system for maintenance of inventory, sort of ensure that you're able to update this record, right, that you have of all this material. If it moves, document the move so that you have an easier, clearer sense of what's going on the next time you do an inventory. Spreading the word and celebrating is really a wonderful thing to be able to do. It can also help you sort of fundraise and know what momentum can be put into different collections and what specific collections need, right? Is there a rehousing project in your future? Is there something that you've found in your inventory work that would be really key for digitization to highlight? Just worth thinking about those few things as you sort of wrap up the project. And so Katie called this section of her presentation also sort of sticky situations, or when inventory work is extra complex. I know it's about to be one, so I'll just sort of spend a few minutes on, right, this was in the program description. So what do we want to do or think about when we have both archival collections and object collections, sort of a mix of stuff that is hard to parse out what you want to be where, and how you want to consider it, right? I wish I had a better answer for this. I wish it was easier to sort of say, like, here's specifically some key things to do, but I think the best approach is really just going to be to try to define your collections. It's likely that you already have some insight into this. So again, like, look at your policies, look at your collection scope, try to understand the distinctions and where different collection lines can lie. And in your collections management policy, right? Ideally, if you have multiple kinds of collections that are managed differently, an archival collection and a museum or object collection, that distinction should be discussed within your policies and procedures documentation. You want to just try to identify broader groupings first. Think about things as high level as possible for all materials. There's another resource that we'll share from the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance. They did a inventory webinar in 2002, and they called this idea chunking, right? Like to sort of group everything into as big a chunks as possible, and then work to drill down to get more specific to where you need to be. Yeah, the other thing that could be helpful in thinking about these distinctions is just to adjust your technology or your collections management system if you have one, if that's what you're using. Even if certain materials are cataloged on an item level, I want to reiterate, right? I don't want you to record every piece of paper in a box or a folder as its own object. So zooming out can be even harder after you've already captured a lot of item by item details to sort of summarize. But you should do your best to try to summarize and sort of engage with higher level records, because that can just help you get a scope of what you're working with. It is really okay for the inventory to like guide you generally to the right place, even if you know you'll have to focus more into the future. This is the other biggest conundrum, I think. I've talked to a lot of folks who are excited to inventory and dive into figuring out what their collections really are, but they wind up stuck when they realize that they can't define their collections because they don't know what they are, right? If they just have really previously never been managed very much at all, stuff's been stuck in a basement, maybe they're not part of your institutional priority, but you want to be incorporating them more into your work. How do you inventory on a collection level if you have to define the collections, but how do you define the collections if you don't know what you have? So this is just hard. There's no better way around saying that. It's hard to do. Consider where a collection starts and stops. You just kind of have to look closely. You do like to understand what you're looking at, but you can also do your best to either be speedy, to make educated guesses, to set a timer maybe, to not spend too long with each section of material, perhaps work in pairs to kind of chat it through and keep each other moving. I think there's a few strategies or approaches you can take. You could also sort of call this like a record survey, just like an even scrappier inventory or run through, right? To sort of just determine the baseline core, like outlines of what you're working with. I know from experience, it's very challenging to not get caught up in the history, the details, the names, the relationships when you're looking at these kinds of materials, partly because it's fun, right? That's the fun part of this job, is the history and the stuff. Especially if it's related to somewhere or something you know, it might be familiar or nostalgic or connective, but jotting down the most basic details of what you can to sort of survey the full scope of materials. Trying to do that first will get you further, right? And then you can, and likely will, refine that information later on. I don't think I have anything else really major that you can't glean from the resources and the slides, which everyone will receive after the presentation. AV collections are unique in that you do kind of want to think about them on an item level. I have some resources for that. Running into hazards is unique. This is the same slide as in Katie's presentation because it's important to consider. And then thinking about not NAGPRA, but sort of archival repatriation of Indigenous collections that you might stumble across or find in your collection, and thinking about a different approach to these materials and perhaps returning them to the Indigenous nations and folks who they originated with is important. Okay. The final thoughts of the presentation are just that we want to help just demystify some inventory work. It doesn't have to be scary. There are a lot of resources. Do your best to take your planning opportunities. And I wanted to correct this comic that I really love in the archive, right? Use a pencil, just don't use a pen. Sorry for going right up till 1 o'clock, but I would love to take any questions. Feel free to contact me after today if you have any other questions or would like some other conversation or direct resources, especially if you're in New York State. We have a whole technical assistance category, which gives me work time to chat through these things with people in their unique situations.
That was great, Kate. Thank you. And no worries. I think that was a lot of great information for folks. So happy to stay on a little bit and have some of these questions answered. So our first question here in the chat comes from Elizabeth. How are admin, as in minutes, treasury, membership lists, etc., records held? Are they accessioned? Are they part of the inventory? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that depends on your organization, right? And your collection. If we're, yeah, I'm not sure if we're talking about like a business who happens to have an archive or like a historical society that sort of has their own, right, generated materials as they have operated over years or decades. So I think it just depends what the scope of your organization is and what you want the scope of your inventory to be. It's totally appropriate to define that stuff as archival collections once it's what, you know, I would say that's like a whole other, if I'm understanding the question right, that's like a records management topic, and part of the question is about like, do these admin materials become archival materials? Sure, if you have a policy to manage that. But I'm sorry if I'm not fully comprehending the structure of what's being asked.
Well, and I think that's a good point. I mean, so much of what we say to people is it depends. And I think that's, you know, that goes back to the goal setting, I think, that you mentioned at the beginning. Like if those admin records are really important to tell the story of your collection, then yeah, they absolutely should be part of the inventory. But if they seem to exist outside of those goals, then maybe not. And that's one of those things that, you know, it's about making that plan.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you are defining it as an archival collection and you're inventorying all the archival collections, then yes. And so that decision about whether it's a collection or not is part of the conversation.
Our next question here, is there a resource of standardized terms for organizing a historical archive?
It's a great question. And I was trying to think about this as I put the presentation together. My first thought is no. In the way that Katie's presentation called out a sort of nomenclature, like a museum nomenclature reference that has a ton of information in it. I think the answer is not really, but I'll try and do a little more digging. There are certainly glossaries, or there are sort of vocabularies, right, that are good to have a shared sense of understanding of certain terms. I feel like I can't even say, because it's coming soon, that the Conservation Center is putting together like a really great glossary for preservation terms and thinking about how we define these things and how they relate to one another. For another example, there's a glossary of like audiovisual artifacts that I think I should include the link to. If you're working on audiovisual collections and you are thinking about those materials, then like it's a great resource to have to be able to describe that stuff. But on a broad sort of historical collections level, I'm not totally sure that there is.
And Kate, thank you for mentioning the preservation glossary. Just a quick plug. I mean, that's going to come out next month, and then be more readily available in April. So stay tuned for that. It's not just about historical archives, but I think we've been giving a lot of thought. I say we, I haven't been as involved in the project, but to that difference that we've been talking about, kind of between how some of these terms are used in a museum setting versus how they're used in an archival setting. So I hope that is a really good resource for you in the future. So stay tuned. I think maybe we're getting a little late. I want to maybe do one more question, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And if you have questions and you want to follow up directly with Kate, please email her at the email address here. So just going down the line, in the past, our archives were given completely new arrangements. For example, a single photographer's scrapbook was separated and the photos were organized by this new system based on thematic descriptions. Would you recommend leaving the collection as is or trying to reinstate the provenance if possible?
That's a hard one. That is certainly also an it depends kind of answer. I don't know, if you think there's a real possibility for reinstating what the collection was as a scrapbook, like accurately, then perhaps. I don't know why I'm hesitating to say yes, go for it, reinstate the original thing, because that's hard, right? To sort of rebuild, regenerate something either to a full degree of accuracy or maybe even to a partial degree of accuracy. If all the stuff is together, is that still better than if it's all separated? The flip side argument for sort of leaving it as is and as it has been separated is that that's just the way it is, and that's what you've got to work with, and that has been documented to some degree, right? You like knew it existed and that wasn't the original form. I think you could probably save yourself some labor by leaving that collection as it is now, or leaving the photographs sort of like in their split up designated way, but ensuring that there's some kind of description built in to reference the fact that, A, C, and E images or materials were a part of a larger collection or a part of an individual photographer's collection at a prior point. Yeah, I would say in terms of an inventory project, if you're thinking about sort of the scope of everything we went over in this webinar, I would inventory by collection as your collections exist to the best of your ability. So if you have something sort of defined as a collection, even if you know it was something else before, you can make that reconciliation intellectually, and you'd only confuse yourself more if you tried to inventory or restructure a collection for another time or a further layer. Yeah, that's the best I got on that one.
Well, yeah, and I think to your point about just record keeping, like if you do decide that it's really a priority to switch it back to the way it was, like you'll still be able to have this record that it was organized by thematic description at one point, for future, inquiry into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it gets back to that, like, is this priority or not question that I think we're touching on here. Yeah, well, okay, just one more question, because I'm seeing a couple things about this, is
Sure.
the use of Excel templates and using Excel for inventorying? Would you recommend Excel? Is that your
Yes.
Excel is your great. I love that. It's a it's a more straightforward
I think
question.
if you have the ability, they're so similar, Excel and Google Sheets, right? If we're talking broadly, like spreadsheet, great tool. Go for it, use a spreadsheet. If you have an easy ability to share that spreadsheet among multiple people who are doing the inventory work, even better, right? To save over files and copies and make sure everyone has the right one and updated one that they're working on all the time can be a little challenging. If you can manage that, that's no problem either. I think thinking about a database and a collection management system are great if you're there, if that is the capacity you have, if you already have a system in place. I wouldn't say like go invest in setting up a system solely to be able to do an inventory. It's certainly helpful, but the collections management system should help you do other things as well. It's certainly worth looking into and prioritizing, but if your goal is just an inventory and especially a basic inventory, then you can absolutely manage that with a spreadsheet.
Well, thank you, Kate.
Yeah,
And
thanks everyone.
thank
Good
you everyone
questions.
for coming. So just again, big thanks to Kate for the presentation today, and Camilla Dawson, who's been helping out behind the scenes with all of the tech and setup for today's webinar. Thanks again to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation, and to all of you for showing up today. So just looking ahead to March, we've got a class coming up called Collections Management Fundamentals and Policies. This is a fully online course. And we're going to have some additional webinars on this inventory topics, I think getting a little more into the sticky situations and the sort of difference between museum and archive inventories coming up starting in April. So please stay tuned for those. And again, this preservation glossary, which I think is going to be a good resource, we hope for a lot of people. So lots to plug today. We hope that we see you in some of these programs and that you continue to make use of our resources. When this program ends, a little survey is going to pop up, just kind of asking how we did. So we love when you fill that out just to give us some data on our program so we can keep making them even better. So thanks everybody, and have a lovely afternoon or whatever time it is where you're tuning in from.
Thanks all. Thanks, Greg.